Chapter 28, Elixir of Love. This is the Eataly website. This most amazing delicatessen restaurant in New York City. My first visit there was 9 years ago. I think it was relatively new then, but I had never heard of it. It is amazing. Of course, now it's only open for takeout. The restaurants are closed, and they're doing delivery as well. It is truly amazing. So back to the story. This chapter, the Elixir of Love. The next morning, Paul took Bluey trotting around Madison Square Park, adjacent to the city's landmark Flatiron Building, and after circling the park, followed the sidewalks that ran through it, with Bluey pausing occasionally to leave an autograph. She suggested meeting across the street at Eataly, an Italian cornucopia of delicatessens, restaurants, desserteries, and cafes under one roof, where they could sample slices of fine prosciutto, the hardest and smelliest of cheeses, choose between fish, pasta, and meateries, and sample a variety of Italian wines. It was a far cry from the rural countryside where Paul lived, reminding him of markets where Mary France educated him about fine food. Paul and Bluey gazed through the window at the stationary feast. He had no idea what Jayne looked like, and imagined her with fair skin, green eyes, and shoulder-length, dirty blonde hair, perhaps tinted with artistic hints of purple, blue, or green. She recognized Bluey and surprised Paul, who was about to learn people rarely look the way you imagine. The scent of roses announced her arrival, unnoticed by Paul, but not by Bluey, who began wiggling his phantom tail. Jayne wore a sprig of white jasmine in her black hair, her eyes as large and dark as olives, her straight teeth white as piano ivory, her skin as smooth and brown as a macadamia shell. She was fashionably casually dressed, in contrast to the scruffy Paul, who had been traveling and camping with his dog, and appeared to be sharing life on the streets with the homeless. "Are you surprised to see me?" she asked. "Most people are. Haven't you ever dined with an African-American who appreciates wine?" "Do the President and Michelle count?" asked Paul, showing her the selfie from the wine summit he kept on his phone. "You're carrying around a photo of yourself with black people? That's a sure sign of a racist." Blue didn't care what she looked like and went straight for her crotch and wagged his wiggle butt with approval. "Good news, you're cancer-free," said Paul. "How do you know?" "Bluey told me." "Good boy, Bluey. He's so adorable," she said, stroking his head and hugging him and welcoming his dog kisses. Paul handed her a bottle of unlabeled wine, on which he had written with a Sharpie, "To the most fragrant woman in the world, the most fragrant wine." "How do you know I'm the most fragrant?" "I learned that from your Twitter feed, and Bluey just confirmed it." Mark arrived to take Bluey, and they agreed to meet by the Bull after lunch. As they talked at a table inside, they learned their life journeys had often crossed, always at different times. Although she grew up in Houston, both of her parents were North Carolina natives, not far from where Paul's father had worked summers growing up. They shared a passion for wine, food, and dogs, and as each peeled an onion layer from their lives, they found they had much in common, such as Jayne's business trips to Japan. She was adventuresome and talked about traveling through Turkey, a country Paul hadn't visited, and about upcoming plans to travel deep into Mexico for a new project. He admired her sense of adventure. She ordered a glass of blush, the color of unicorn, she said, while he wanted to try a white and selected a Pinot Grigio. "Would you like a sip?" she asked, handing him her glass. "I don't know you well enough to kiss you," said Paul, turning the glass so the curl mark of her lipstick was on the far side. "If my lips were to drink from the same spot as yours, this would be the most delicious wine I ever tasted." "Is lipstick a food or a drink?" "Yes, and howsoever you offered, I would taste." "What's the best wine you ever tasted?" she asked. "The Petit Verdot I just gave you. I can't wait to try it." They were interrupted by a middle-aged woman with a slight European accent who arrived on a whirlwind. Buongiorno to such a beautiful couple, and welcome to Italy. I observed you talking so intently, and I know you didn't have time to look at the menu, so I'm going to recommend something special that's perfect for you. Pasta d'amore. That sounds wonderful, said Jayne. Let's try it. You know, we have a special red wine today I'm going to serve you. Elixir d'amore. Perfect, said Paul. Grazie. My name is Lydia. Just call me if you need anything. And they smiled as they heard her say as she left. Such a lovely couple. As they sipped the red, Jayne radiated harmony. She wore a soft, oversized flannel shirt Paul assumed was her boyfriend's. She hurriedly slipped on. Paul observed the flow of the kitchen and noticed the other waiters coming up to their server, who gave them instructions, and Paul assumed she was the maitre d'. Jayne said she was one of the owners. When Lydia returned with the pasta, Paul told her about the Aglianico grapes he grew and Nebbiolo wine he made from grapes grown by Camillo, an Italian transplant across the border from San Diego and Mexico. You know, I met Camillo when I visited Cento Winery, Lydia said. You must send us some of your Aglianico to try. Fortunately, Paul met Jayne before Cassandra, for he was a serial monogamist who could only be in love with one woman at a time, or so he thought. Perhaps there was something in the atmosphere, the wine, or the pasta. For every minute that passed and his glass became more empty, his heart became more full, and the more Jayne revealed about her life, her college degree, her work in Detroit, her visits to Japan, her experience designing fragrances for commercial consumer products, the more he appreciated her intelligence, street smarts, and buoyancy. He was struck by the beauty of this not at all plain Jayne, with hair straighter than the iron-shaped building overlooking them. I wonder how she gets it so straight, keeping that question to himself. How do you like the wine? Lydia asked. I love it, said Paul. I love it too, said Jayne. This is why we call it the Elixir of Love. To amore. To Italy, toasted Paul. To Bluey and the Bootleggers Express, toasted Jayne. They clinked glasses and looked into each other's eyes, and as they drained their glasses, their hearts filled with adrenaline. You know, I see a lot of couples in this restaurant, and it seems to me the parfumista has fallen for the winemaker like Romeo and Juliet. Mamma mia, said Lydia, star-crossed lovers. Are you a fortune-teller too? Paul asked as she sped off to check on the kitchen. He looked into Jayne's eyes and posed. What is the aroma of amore? It's the fusion of 100 salted tortellini carcasses hanging from the ceiling with bread browning in the oven, hissing steam from a screaming espresso machine, plus the nougat of hazelnut gelato and musty black currants of wine served at La Scala, topped with the earthy notes of a vintner, with hints of his dog's thick fur. Paul thought the essence of amore was being with Jayne. She sensed his affection, companionship, and caring for Bluey, which had evaporated from her marriage, and his passion living a fully engaged life. As much as they talked openly about dreams, ambitions, work, and goals, he never asked about her first husband, and she never asked about Sheila. In my next life, I want to come back as your dog, Jayne said. If you do, I'll rub your belly and pick you up and hug you every day. I'd like that. He told her about Cougar Carrion, Merlot Mac, Steph and John, Miguel the Pirate, and the cast of characters in the community, and she said she'd like to visit someday. She presented him with one of her wine-inspired fragrances. Paul uncapped the notes of Merlot and sprayed some on the back of his hand he lifted to his nose. What do you think? She asked. I lost my sense of smell on a visit to India. Oh, no! You're anasamic? How horrible! Said the woman whose livelihood and essence of being depended on her nose. What on earth happened? I went to Delhi and breathed the thick, dark smog through the filter of my nostrils that clogged with soot. My nose was never the same. How can you possibly make wine? With Bluey, He tastes the wines for me. The best sommelier in the world is a dog. What did you think of India? I'm working on a project there and planning to go. Be sure to protect your precious nose. My first trip there in 1986 was wonderful. The sights, sounds, and fragrances were amazing. You would love it. I walked and walked and walked and walked all the streets and narrow alleys of Bombay. I remember the flower merchants with their strings of gardenias, jasmine, and exotic flowers. I have no idea the names. Walking through slums, odors of raw sewage, garbage, rotting produce, even a corpse, rats scurrying at night. I've seen those in New York too. All the fruits in the outdoor market, tropical fruits, mangosteens, lychees, durian. Oh my God, durian, the king of fruits. When you get past the smell, you've got it licked. The aroma is so pungent, it's banned from hotels and airplanes. You either hate it or love it. The fruit, so powerful tasting, yet sweet. I met a fragrance vendor on the street with over 100 scents. She picked one for me. I wore the rest of my trip, since bathing wasn't always an option. What a scent smorgasbord for your nasal palate. Just watch out for acrid air polluted by diesel and gas exhaust and particles of burning coal and dung. On a business trip to Delhi 10 years later, when I sneezed into a white tissue, I was shocked to see such black gunk, and by the end of the week, I couldn't smell a thing. Someday, I'll teach you to smell again. As they stood to leave, Paul lifted her glass of unfinished wine, kissed the mark of her lipstick, and drank the last sips of the most luscious wine he couldn't taste. He invited her to join the protest to help hand out wine and perfume, which some of the marchers could use, and mentioned he had an extra ticket to a jazz concert at Carnegie Hall that evening. Part of the proceeds were to be donated to the movement, and Paul was bringing wine to the band's leader, a classmate from elementary school days. When Paul, Bluey, and Jayne arrived at the Wall Street Bull, they found Mark talking with a woman, not dressed to protest. Paul assumed she was a TV reporter for Foxy News, as she wore heavy makeup, heels, and was wrapped in a tight-fitting dress. She walked straight to Paul, and ignoring Jayne, said, "Why, hello, Paul, how y'all doing? I'm Cassandra from Jackson, Mississippi, and I've come all the way up here to meet you and see the Bootlegger Express and try some of that little Verdot wine of yours." Who the hell is this bitch? Thought Jayne, biting her tongue. The nerve of her walking up and butting in when she saw us talking with each other. "Nice to meet you," said Paul. "Are you planning to march in those?" he asked, pointing to her high-heeled pumps. Bluey took a sniff and looked away. "These are my comfortable shoes," she said, spreading Southern charm, thicker than mayonnaise on a white bread tomato sandwich. "I want to march with the Bootleggers Express because I'm against states' rights," she said with a wink to Jayne. Jayne's radar beeped, high alert, detecting a snake in the grass. "You better watch out for her," she whispered in Paul's ear. "I'll meet you at Carnegie at 7. And she pecked his cheek with a soft kiss that Paul hoped was a down payment for a mortgage. With Jayne gone, Cassandra had Paul's full attention and inserted her hand through his arm, ushering him closely down the streets, showing him the direction to Carnegie Hall, speaking in a southern sing-song voice that accompanied primordial memories of his grandmother, a Mayfair Queen of Virginia. He was entranced. Taught by his father the ritual of debutante balls, Paul clasped his fist, placed it against his belly to better hold her arm in his, and escorted her arm in arm with that day's marchers. Paul felt something, unsure what it was, a yearning rise from within. Subconsciously, the sound of a kind southern voice cast a spell over him as powerful as that of the vines, a result of the loving songs and cuddles from his grandmother as an infant. He buzzed like a bee around fresh grape juice as she marched with a "Free the Grape" sign. Joey might have punched her had he seen that. Cassandra, a.k.a. Jessica, knew where Paul's eyes were drawn, and he made every possible excuse to interject a clever phrase, comment, or joke. His daughter repeatedly told him when she was a teenager, "Dad, you think you're funny, but you're not," an observation shared by Cassandra as she listened to Paul. Yet she was pleased, because she was a Venus flytrap who would soon capture Paul, then turn from flower to venomous spider, having spun her web, would wrap him, stun him, then put a swift end to all this nonsense before it impacted her clients. Cassandra hinted she would appreciate a sit-down lunch, and Paul suggested Southern food. He would gladly eat a second lunch to spend time with her. They took a cab to Harlem with Bluey, and as they walked down the sidewalk, she, 3 inches taller than him in heels, he, thinking they would be equal height in bed, took Paul's hand and guided him to a restaurant with a terrace and the finest Southern food north of the Mason-Dixie line. Bluey followed, baffled by her scent. They ordered fried catfish, fried chicken, pulled pork barbecue, fried okra, mac and cheese, and tea, sweet as Cassandra, Paul described it, and she smiled. For dessert, they shared the same spoon and a slice of Mississippi mud pie with chocolate thick as a river's and wine's bottom sediment. "There's 3 good things in Mississippi," she said. "What are those?" he asked. "The 3 W's, and water, whiskey, and women," she smiled. "When is the Bootleggers Express coming to Ole Miss?" she asked. "It's a good place for you." "How's the moonshine?" "Wonderful." "As good as this?" Paul asked, offering her his flask, from which she sipped without hesitations. "My stars! What's this? It's wonderful." "Grape moonshine. This one we laced with passion fruit. We've made other batches with blueberries, strawberries, and pomegranates." "Have you ever made it with bacon?" "Bacon moonshine? Sugar. If you make it with bacon, you'll own the South." "I'll try someday," he said, feeling the call from the wild of his Southern genes. When they were finished eating, they strolled outside, and Paul confided, "When we met, and you took my arm, I felt I was in heaven. When I die, my heaven would be walking along a trail of southern pines with you arm in arm." "Oh, Paul, you're so sweet. Don't wait to die. Take my arm now, and let's walk back to your hotel." Bluey barked, the same bark when he saw a snake. "We don't have a hotel. We're sleeping in the bootlegger van. But let's call a taxi and ride back to Wall Street." Bluey jumped in first, Cassandra in the middle, and Paul on her right, taking her arm, experiencing his heaven on earth. "Paul, I know some people who support what you're doing. They could sponsor a hotel for you." "And Bluey too?" "And Bluey too," she answered, with more love in her voice than the good witch of the north. He gave her linked arm a friendly snuggle, and she felt the power of his flexed bicep as she snuggled back. Paul felt his triceps against the soft cashmere sweater warming her right breast. "I'm so glad you came all the way to see us," said Paul. "Me too," she said. "I'm going to miss you when I leave. You know, Paul, there's a lot of bootleggers in Mississippi. Y'all ought to think of coming down to see us. You and Bluey can stay on my parents' farm. We have sheep, you know," she said to Bluey, whose ears picked up. "Just think how much fun it would be for Bluey to hear the sheep." She didn't need to add. Just imagine how fun it would be to play with her in the hayloft. Paul hid the bulge in his pants, rising faster than yeast pitched in a bowl of 98.6-degree grape juice. Cassandra hadn't planned to put him out of commission by making his balls bluer than his dog, but Paul had trouble marching that afternoon and needed to return to the bootlegger's van to rest, as his gonads felt like 2 balls in a string tied to a stick that clacked. He handed Bluey over to Mark, and Cassandra promised she'd work on getting a better place for them to stay for the protest's duration. After a short rest, Paul began walking to Carnegie Hall, carrying a case of wine. He raised his arm to catch a cab, But a shift change combined with a busy Saturday night meant every cab was full. After each block, he turned to see a cab headed his way, always full. So he turned and figured he'd walk the whole way. As a fitness challenge, what started out as exercise soon became work, lugging a 30-pound case. He was lucky. This was before he and Sheila started using the thick, heavy bottles that spoke to the person pulling the cork. This is the best bottle in the world, containing the best wine, whose cases were at least 10 pounds heavier. He arrived at Carnegie's backstage entrance, his clothes damp with sweat. Worried odors he couldn't detect seeped from his body, and found Jayne waiting. "I should have taken a shower before coming here," he apologized. "Your nose knows." "I'll smell for myself," she replied, closing her eyes and inhaling deeply through her nostrils. "This is who you are. Odors of sweating armpits, 5-day unwashed socks mixed with a splash of hairy dog who trampled through wet grass in Central Park. My nose tells me you're creative, intelligent, someone who works hard outside with his hands, a good hunter, a good provider. What's not to like about your natural scent?" she said, pecking him on the cheek, softer than the previous lip plant. "Hello, nice to see you again." "You're as enchanting as a fairy," said Paul, in the presence of an earth goddess. He took a deep breath and silently, slowly exhaled to calm himself from the effort to get there. He rang the bell of the musician's entrance and held up the case of wine for the guard to see. "Special delivery from the Bootleggers Express." "Hey, boss, we've been expecting you. Come in." He carried the case into the guard's office, saying, "Please keep an eye on this. It's the best wine ever made, for Russ and the band." "Sure, boss." The large portrait of Isaac Stern reminded Paul he was walking on hallowed musical ground. Russ and Paul became friends the day they entered kindergarten at Delmar Heights Elementary. Although they were both in band, Paul followed sports and lost touch with Russ, who had gone off to Harvard, and they didn't see each other until their 30th high school reunion, where Paul reconnected with Rachel and Russ' band provided the music. They stayed in touch, and when Paul learned Russ was playing in New York the same time the Bootleggers Express was headed there, he offered to bring wine. What Paul didn't realize is this wasn't Russ's band, but Russ was one of a dozen musicians backing up Mahmoud Ahmed. Who? The Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, and Frank Sinatra of Ethiopia. Paul, the self-proclaimed winemaker to the bishop, added another title to his resume: wine sponsor of Mahmoud Ahmed, his passport to mingling with Afropop rock star royalty for an evening, and a good conversation starter with Ethiopian taxi and Uber drivers he met in subsequent years. The diaspora of Addis Ababa descended upon Carnegie Hall, filling the aisles with arm-waving, hand-clapping, and syncopated bobbing to the gentle rock rhythms and melodies of their homeland. For Paul, a first-time visitor to the hallowed stage of Heifetz, Isaac Stern, and the world's best musicians, he never imagined this cathedral of classical, musical, transformed into a dance hall. Though he couldn't comprehend the words, he felt the beat and emotion as he and Jade stood in front of their seats and jumped right in, and before the end of the second song, they were fast friends with the strangers surrounding them, who sat stoically before the concert began. Good music and good dancing make good friends, and the audience, transported by the sounds of music and beats of bongos, snares, electric bass, trumpet, and saxophone, the latter played by Russ, who stood up, as did Paul, for they grew up in San Diego's Whitopia, found themselves among a community of Ethiopians and African Americans, dancing and singing with joy. Paul had witnessed the kingdom of heaven at Dog Beach. Here he was again at heaven's gates, a glimpse of the kingdom on earth, with Jayne and the brothers and sisters of Ethiopia. Mahmoud was approaching 70 years young and danced and sang with vigor. Paul said to Jayne, I want to move and sing like that when I'm his age." "I'm sure you will," she said, and bumped her rump against his as an incentive to never stop moving. Halfway through the performance, Mahmoud pointed to Paul and told the audience he was marching for the people, and asked those willing to join the rally for justice, planned the next day, the beginning of the end of Paul's 15 minutes of fame, as he waved to Mahmoud's fans. After the concert, Russ texted instructions to meet him, Mahmoud, and the band at the Queen of Sheba restaurant for the after-party. Jayne Googled the location and said, "They close at midnight. It's already 11:30. Paul texted Russ, who answered, "Mahmoud's a rock star. They'll stay open all night for him." Indeed, when they arrived, just after midnight, the place was packed. "Doesn't this remind you of Tokyo trains at rush hour?" Jayne said to Paul as they merged into the crowd. "Exactly what I was thinking," said Paul. "I'm keeping all hands on deck. I don't want anyone to think I'm being fresh. I'm squeezed between 4 women." "If you need a safe place for your hands, take mine," said Jayne, and Paul gladly complied. As they limboed their way to the head table, where Mahmoud sat surrounded by his entourage, people asked Paul, "Are you in the band?" "No, I'm Mahmoud's winemaker." "Have some Ethiopian wine," said one, and Paul drank from the cup and washed down some lentils. A man sitting next to Mahmoud said, "Thank you for sharing your wine." "My eyes aren't so good. Please excuse me," said Paul. "Who are you?" "I'm the drummer." "Man, you rock." Jayne looked around the crowd, reciting the rap lyric. "There she goes again, the dopest Ethiopian." She wore a white orchid fastened to her black hair and appeared to be the reincarnation of the Queen of Sheba. She blended right in. But when she spoke, everyone asked, "Are you Ethiopian?" "I'm African American," she replied. "How do you know your ancestors are not from Ethiopia?" "They were slaves." Russ overheard the conversation and told Paul the Ethiopian community didn't share the history and injustices of American slavery. "I have something for you," Paul told Russ, pulling the flask from his backpack. "It's great moonshine." "Where did you get it?" "I made it. Well, my friends in Kentucky made it. They have this still. I supplied the wine. It smells really good. Taste." Russ brought the flask to his lips, and raw distillate cleansed his mouth. "This is good." "I aspire for it to be as good as your sax playing," said Paul. Bartenders and owners of most Manhattan restaurants do not look favorably upon a patron bringing a flask into their establishment, nor is it allowed, but in the company of celebrity, almost anything goes, and the restaurant owner asked for a sip too. "Give some to Mahmoud," suggested the restaurant's owner. "He likes grappa." Paul passed the flask to Mahmoud, who sipped, and passed the flask to the woman sitting next to him, some 20 years younger, for whom the sea of masses parted when she entered and took her place next to the king. "There she goes again, the dopest Ethiopian." "That's Mahmoud's companion," Russ explained to Paul and Jayne. "They have a special relationship. They have known each other a long time." "Their age difference is less than ours," Paul said to Jayne, who missed what he said because of the loud music. On stage, Mahmoud had the vigor and energy of someone Paul's age, and yet, with so much spirit spent on the performance, Paul saw Mahmoud was human, his face drawn and tired. "You want some wine?" a man asked Paul, who lifted a pitcher of mead, an Ethiopian specialty. At the back of the restaurant was a dance area where a DJ spun Mahmoud songs, as fans danced like worms, wriggling in dirt, moving where there was space. There was a cool, mellow vibe to the place. They twisted, jiggled, and shuffled to the rhythms and lyrics of Mahmoud, with Paul jumping freely as a child on a sugar high, bouncing on a pogo stick, until the music slowed, and he took Jayne's right hand with his left, and with his right hand behind her back, pulled her close. "I think I detect your pheromones," she said. "My what?" asked Paul, who had no idea what she was talking about. "Your scent. What do I smell like?" "Curious." "Curious as a cat?" "As in curious and curiouser." "I don't understand." "Don't even try. Just dance. and they danced until the music stopped. Paul checked the time, 3 a.m., and Jayne suggested they walk to Times Square. The normally bustling landmark was empty, except for a bag lady and some stragglers. Starbucks was open, and Paul ordered a double espresso, pulled slowly, ristretto style. He poured the last ounce of moonshine from his flask into the paper cup and handed it to Jayne. "Caffè corretto, my favorite," she said. "I drank this every night I was in Rome." "I've never been to Rome," said Paul. "What's it like?" "Like Dorothy, hitching a ride on a tornado and landing in a magical city of wine, food, lights, fashion, and fountains. It was amazing. I want to visit Italy someday, to meet the winemakers and try their wines." "Let's meet there next time." "Maybe we will." They stepped outside, into sprinkling mist, Paul unsure of his footing, not used to wet sidewalks. "It only rains when someone important is in town," said Jayne. "It must be for the Queen of Sheba," he said, looking into her eyes, searching for her soul. "Or her winemaker." Paul hailed a cab. They hugged. He sent her home and walked to the van where Mark and Bluey slept. Paul laid down next to Bluey, closed his eyes, and replayed every scene with the scent sommelier, while she, back at her apartment, slowly savored a glass of wine from the bottle of Petit Verdot he gave her, and would have kissed him on the spot had he been there. As much as he dreamed of that long, tender kiss in person instead of in a text message. Their paths would cross often, but not their lips. You probably remember how it all ended. Cassandra, a.k.a. Jessica Fackhandler, diverted the attention of the marchers, interns, and journalists from the human interest story of the Bootleggers Express to the larger issue of economic inequality, which grabbed the attention of liberals, leftists, commies, anarchists, revolutionaries, and the rest of the 99% of the population. Depending on with whom he was talking, Paul would take credit, or he wouldn't, for starting Occupy Wall Street, which was Jessica's brainchild, while he shared the group's concern about the societal impacts of skewed wealth distribution and anger towards unpunished bankers responsible for the economic crisis who wouldn't lower the interest rate on his house. He aspired to make it into the ranks of the 1% and, echoing the president's optimism, kept hope alive. Paul had made his point about the cartel and the country's archaic wine distribution system and achieved his second 15 minutes of fame after the wine summit. He was out of money, and it was time to head back, although a voice inside floated the idea of staying in New York an extra day, so he might, just might, see Jayne again. The deciding factor in returning to San Diego was Mark, who, miracle of miracles, found a job. Jessica had contacted the largest wine distributor on the West Coast and asked a favor, and no sooner was she off the phone, Mark received a call from the company saying they heard he was a wine aficionado, experienced making wine, working in a vineyard and a tasting room, and with that background, he'd make an ideal sales representative. "Would you be available for an interview later this week?" "Oh, you're in New York? Not a problem. We'll purchase a ticket for you to fly out tomorrow." And so Mark flew to Los Angeles and was hired on the spot. He was grateful for the position, worked hard, exceeded his sales quota, and his manager saw a bright future for him. With the loss of Mark and Occupy Wall Street gaining a life of its own beyond their control, Paul and Bluey boarded the van and turned west, delivering wine along the way and trading wine for lodging, food, and gas, returning to San Diego to a vineyard and spouse needing attention. Mark and Sheila greeted the duo when they arrived, and Bluey, so excited to see Mistress and Mark, ran circles around the three. Sheila informed Paul, "You caught another mouse." "Where?" "In your car." "You didn't clean it out?" "That's your job." Paul opened the door to the vineyard mobile, and the stench was worse than great big gobs of greasy, grimy gopher guts, mutilated squirrel meat, rotten gophers' funky feet, Mark barely held down his lunch. Paul warned everyone to step back as he opened the other door to let the air out and saw maggots swimming through the mouse's remains. "We need a cat," said Paul. "You need a job," said Sheila. He had a lead, a great lead. Jenny Lee sent him information about a new California-based company called ClassCloud that offered a cloud-based service to track not only students' grades, but any classroom metric that could be measured: attendance, course load, extracurricular activities, teachers' comments, and more. The service, powered by artificial intelligence, worked with teachers' computers, iPads, mobile phones, and those new low-cost computing things called Chromebooks, which meant the teacher could input data and review it practically anywhere, while students could study anytime, anywhere, and work collaboratively on projects in person and remotely using the student app. ClassCloud crunched data using AI to proactively suggest to teachers challenging assignments for students who excelled in a particular area, and identified at-risk students long before current methods that were often too late. Jenny Lee's district piloted this new personalized learning service and would deploy it district-wide next year. "It's the real deal," she tweeted Paul. "Bigger than Texas Tempranillo. There's even a parents app, so they can communicate with teachers to see what their kids are working on and how they're doing. This is life-changing and literally life-saving." Paul thought, if something's that good, he'd check it out. He contacted the company, talked his way into an interview, and the VP of Sales sensed his enthusiasm and desire to help teachers and students. Paul had already given away wine to the people. Now he wanted to devote his working time to a company that helped society, and if he was paid for the work, all the better. He was hired to evangelize at each state's education technology conference. ClassCloud grew by leaps and bounds, with school districts eager to improve student outcomes. Paul was invited to speak at a breakout session at a conference in Louisville called KISTE, Kentucky Society for Technology and Education, where he arrived with a case of wine. This was the first and only EdTech conference he attended, where bourbon was offered next to the punch at the evening opening reception. Paul felt right at home and passed around a flask of his version of bourbon made from grapes, fondly remembering the stop of the Bootleggers Express when he was introduced to distilling. A not too shabby public speaker from his experience rallying followers on Wall Street. The next morning, when Paul addressed a room full of educators, there were tears in some teachers' eyes as he described with detailed data the transformative outcomes for students, teachers, and districts adopting ClassCloud. In the online social network of teachers and technology directors, word of ClassCloud and its eloquent evangelists who gave wine to teachers spread fast as wildfire, and soon Paul was invited to be a featured speaker at EdTech conferences in other states. Whenever he made a pilgrimage to Mecca, the Mississippi Education Computing Conference held in Jackson, as he dined in the city's finer establishments, he never failed to ask the head waiter if they knew a fashionable beauty named Cassandra. He kept hope alive. In the past, Paul worked for wine. Now he worked for hugs from teachers, and when he was on a speaking tour, traveling state to state, he was sure to carry a case of wine to share, and though he never attained the celebrity of Carrie Ann, with tens of thousands of followers, he was content to bring wine to teachers. Not only was his position fun and spiritually rewarding, what could be better than assisting students do better in school and making teachers' tough tasks easier? The job allowed he, Sheila, and Bluey to keep their property, their terroir, their terra, from foreclosure. It took a decade to claw his way back financially, and 10 years to the day Lehman Brothers collapsed, the unofficial anniversary of the Great Recession. Paul paid back the loans from Sallie Mae and Wells Fargo Bank he used to fund his children's education, and every cent he borrowed from Sheila's retirement account to Kate and Alex with interest in accordance with her wishes.